Stop everything you think you know about the conflict. The history books gave you one neat, inspiring narrative regarding American Special Forces. They were supposedly the most technologically advanced, aggressively trained, and feared soldiers on Earth, arriving in Vietnam and bending the oppressive jungle entirely to their iron will. It is an incredibly impressive story, but it is unfortunately the wrong story. Because deep inside the wet, suffocating darkness of the Vietnamese highlands, the Americans who thought they were the undisputed apex predators ran into a handful of allied Australians who operated completely differently. These Australians possessed something that no amount of American firepower, cutting-edge technology, or boundless courage could ever match. They had mastered something utterly invisible, something almost inhuman, something that effectively turned the most lethal and capable operators on the planet into very confused, deeply humbled students. This specific narrative is definitively not the sanitized story that standard history channels put together for mass consumption. Rather, this is the authentic account that survived exclusively in hushed whispers between hardened veterans in the decades since, never officially written down or formally acknowledged by high command. Official acknowledgement would necessarily mean admitting a deeply uncomfortable truth. It would mean conceding that the absolute best army in the world had to learn the most critically important lesson of that brutal war from a small group of allied men who barely made a sound. What exact physiological phenomenon turned a hardened Navy SEAL point man completely to stone in the middle of a flowing river? What specific sleeping camp incident occurred that fundamentally traumatized every single American operator who miraculously survived it? We must finally unearth these buried classified secrets together. You might confidently think you fully understand the mechanics of elite modern warfare. However, you are truly only at the beginning of a profound realization. Do not look away, because what we systematically uncover here will permanently alter the fundamental lens through which you view every single soldier who has ever dared to call themselves special. The historical encounter between elite United States forces and the Australian Special Air Service Regiment during the Vietnam War is officially described as a highly successful, clean, diplomatic, and utterly forgettable routine coalition military partnership. Yet, the actual men who were physically present on those dense jungle patrols will cautiously tell you something vastly different when the recording cameras are finally turned off and the bourbon is poured. They will explicitly tell you that this praised partnership was not clean at all. Instead, it was a deeply jarring, psychologically shattering, slow-motion collision between two completely opposing theories of applied military violence. Furthermore, the confident Americans, for a surprisingly long duration, absolutely did not understand that they were actively losing this fundamental philosophical argument regarding survival. To truly comprehend what made this specific cultural encounter so incredibly seismic, you logically have to go back to the origins before the jungle itself. You must systematically trace back before the Vietnam conflict altogether, peering deeply into the completely separate historical forge fires that painfully created these two distinct warrior cultures. Elite military units simply do not appear out of thin air. They are methodically built, agonizing layer by agonizing layer, directly out of the specific environmental nightmares and brutal historical lessons of their respective past combat deployments and national tragedies. The nightmares that systematically built these two highly lethal forces were fundamentally about as distinct as it is practically possible for human nightmares to be. The legendary American Special Operations tradition deployed in Vietnam was originally forged in sheer speed and overwhelming violence. It was violently born in the crashing, freezing surf of the vast Pacific theater during the Second World War. Underwater demolition teams bravely swam toward fortified enemy beaches that were already aggressively shooting at them, detonating massive obstacles before the heavy landing craft even arrived on the shore. That incredibly intense historical culture of hitting extremely fast, striking with overwhelming kinetic force, and absolutely never stopping forward, movement quickly became the foundational genetic code of the specific units that would eventually become the Navy SEALs. By the eventful time those highly trained men arrived in the brutal theater of Vietnam, they were aggressively operating deep in the murky Mekong Delta. They fully utilized a combat doctrine that was almost poetic in its sheer, brutal simplicity and absolute reliance on overwhelming offensive firepower and unmatched extraction speed. Their standard operating procedure was to violently neutralize the assigned target, rapidly exploit any available tactical intelligence, and immediately extract before the disoriented enemy could effectively organize any meaningful armed response. In this context, raw speed was not merely considered a useful battlefield tactic. Incredible speed was the entire foundational philosophy of their existence. The ultimate objective was to physically move much faster than the enemy forces could cognitively process, to strike decisively before the enemy could react, and to disappear completely before the enemy could coordinate a retaliation. Within the treacherous Mekong Delta, representing a confusing labyrinth of twisting rivers, dense reed beds, and sudden perilous expanses of open water, this hyper-aggressive combat doctrine proved to be devastatingly effective. The elite SEAL teams quickly became mythical legends navigating those hostile waterways. They were widely known as ghost boats, literal phantoms of the dark river. These were terrifying men who could seamlessly materialize directly inside a fortified enemy position in the dead of the night, executing a critical mission with precise, surgical, and utterly overwhelming physical violence. They would reliably vanish into the thick fog before the sharp sound of their fatal gunshots had even finished ominously echoing across the black water. They were definitively the absolute best in the entire world at what they specifically did. They confidently knew it, and their terrified enemies certainly knew it as well. When these American operators were eventually assigned by high command to share designated operational combat zones with the Australian forces, they initially arrived possessing the quiet, unspoken confidence of dangerous men who never questioned their own methods. Meanwhile, the Allied Australians arrived from a completely different psychological direction entirely. Geographically, both elite military forces were indeed operating within the exact same muddy, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous combat theater. However, strictly speaking in psychological, doctrinal, and philosophical terms, the Australian Special Air Service had been meticulously shaped by a brutal tradition of irregular warfare that bore almost absolutely no recognizable resemblance to the American SEAL kinetic approach. Their distinct combat lineage logically did not run through crashing oceanic surf or massive amphibious beachhead assaults. Instead, their historical lineage ran directly through the scorching Libyan desert and the sweltering, incredibly exhausting counterinsurgency military campaigns of Malaya and Borneo. They possessed extensive years of grueling long-range combat patrol work, navigating through some of the absolute most inhospitable and punishing jungle terrain located anywhere on Earth. They had deliberately learned incredibly slowly and painfully, calculating a steep cost strictly measured in lost human lives, that operating aggressively in incredibly dense vegetation against an indigenous enemy who intimately knew the local ground was a massive tactical liability. They understood deeply that making noise or moving with unnecessary speed would ultimately get you killed. The singular factor that reliably kept you breathing in those unforgiving environments was your carefully cultivated ability to be noticeably less present than the ambient air actively surrounding you. The goal was to silently move through a dense jungle and leave the foliage exactly as you initially found it. They could exist comfortably hidden in hostile enemy territory for many consecutive days or even weeks without ever accidentally revealing their physical presence. Their foundational combat doctrine was definitively not built upon the overwhelming kinetic violence of immediate aggressive action. Instead, it was meticulously built strictly upon the absolute iron discipline of calculated physical restraint. This required the psychological willingness to patiently watch, quietly wait, systematically gather vital intelligence, and successfully withdraw without ever actually pulling a weapon's trigger. They profoundly recognized that engaging the enemy and loudly pulling a trigger was frequently the absolute least strategically effective action a soldier could possibly undertake during a sensitive intelligence-gathering mission. By the crucial time the Australian Special Air Service formally deployed to Vietnam's dangerous Phuoc Tuy province, they had meticulously refined this unique operational philosophy into an intense practice that bordered directly on the spiritual. Absolute silence was not merely considered a useful survival technique. For these specialized Australian soldiers, maintaining profound silence was treated identically to an incredibly strict religion. When the very first joint international combat patrols were finally officially authorized by military command, the extreme philosophical differences explicitly showed up within mere minutes, not hours. The heavily armed American SEALs confidently arrived directly at the designated jungle insertion point, possessing the barely suppressed kinetic energy that heavily characterized absolutely everything they did. Their lethal weapons were aggressively checked. Crucial communications were loudly verified, and their heavy combat boots aggressively hit the soft ground with the highly purposeful, undeniable authority of elite military men who fully know exactly how inherently dangerous and incredibly capable they are. The observing Australians quietly stepped off the helicopters, possessing an outward demeanor that looked almost surprisingly like casual nonchalance. However, absolutely nothing about their specific physical preparation was actually careless or casual. Every single piece of their issued combat equipment had been meticulously taped, carefully wrapped, intentionally dulled, or heavily padded to eliminate noise. Any metal buckles that might potentially clink were tightly bound in soft green cloth. Their standard bootlaces were intentionally tied using highly specific methods designed entirely to prevent the small, rhythmic, slapping sound that a loose canvas lace inevitably makes when repeatedly striking against the damp, unpredictable floor of the dense tropical jungle. Furthermore, their heavy weapons were definitely not comfortably slung over their shoulders for simple ease of travel. Rather, they were precisely positioned for the exact repetitive physical movements that each individual man had obsessively practiced many thousands of times before. And when they finally stepped cautiously into the dark tree line and the thick green canopy heavily closed entirely over their heads, they immediately did something highly unnatural that made the confident American point man physically stop in his tracks and completely look behind him in absolute stunned disbelief. They completely vanished from his field of vision. Not literally, of course, because they were physically standing right there within arm's reach. But somehow, the complex visual relationship between their camouflaged physical bodies and the immediately surrounding natural jungle foliage shifted in a highly profound way that was incredibly difficult for the American to articulate and significantly harder to rationally explain. They seamlessly became an integral, indistinguishable part of the natural green texture itself, perfectly executing the ultimate psychological hook that would change the Americans forever. The very first authentic operational test of this deeply unsettling coalition dynamic materialized a mere 200 meters directly out from the original helicopter insertion point. A distinctly low, highly indistinct auditory disturbance, possibly indicating subtle physical movement, softly emerged from the dense, tangled vegetation located immediately ahead on the planned patrol route. It was potentially just a common foraging animal, or perhaps it was absolutely nothing at all. The highly trained American SEAL Point man instantly froze in place, sharply signaling a complete tactical halt with the rapid, automatic competence characteristic of a premier Tier 1 military operator. He smoothly turned his head backward to physically check the immediate tactical positioning of the allied Australian elements following closely behind him. They were already entirely gone from his line of sight. They were definitively not gone in the literal sense of being physically absent from the immediate area, but they were remarkably gone in the eerie sense of being completely dissolved into the surrounding foliage. The specific Australian soldier who had literally just been silently walking a mere 3 feet to his immediate left was now functionally invisible to the highly trained naked human eye. This specific allied operator had seemingly been entirely absorbed into a chaotic, natural cluster of thick, twisting tree roots and decaying dead tropical ferns. He was concealed so completely and flawlessly that the highly experienced American commando literally had to intently stare directly at the specific spot for several long, confusing seconds. Only then did the vague, indistinct outline of a breathing human shape slowly and magically resolve itself directly out from the messy, cluttered visual background of the dense jungle floor. Absolutely no discernible auditory sound had accompanied this incredibly sudden, seemingly supernatural physical transformation. There had been no telltale rustle of dry leaves, no heavy misplaced footfall, and no accidental snapping of brittle twigs. The heavily armed Australian soldier had simply and quietly ceased to objectively exist as a distinct, identifiable physical object operating within the observable physical world. The mixed international combat patrol completely held its static defensive perimeter position without making a single sound. 10 agonizingly slow minutes quietly passed without any further auditory disturbance. Then 20 full minutes steadily elapsed as the heavily armed men remained completely frozen in place, intently listening to the surrounding environment. The surrounding primordial jungle naturally spoke continuously all around their hidden, static positions in its own private, ancient, and highly complex language. This dense auditory environment consisted of continuous, rhythmic insect noise, the sudden random dripping of collected canopy moisture, and the highly distinct, distant, echoing complaint of a disturbed tropical bird. 30 full minutes eventually dragged by in agonizing, absolute physical immobility. The exceptionally trained American special operators, explicitly conditioned to act as the absolute most disciplined and patient maritime commandos operating within the entire Mekong Delta, were severely tested. These lethal Americans were suddenly beginning to physically feel the very first uncomfortable internal tremors of deep, frustrated, burning impatience. This was definitively not because they were psychologically weak or physically incapable of enduring extreme sustained hardship. Rather, it was strictly because their entire foundational combat doctrine and aggressive operational mindset were inherently calibrated to a vastly different internal tactical clock. They were culturally built for sudden, overwhelming kinetic action, not endless static observation. In stark contrast, the surrounding Australian operators had absolutely not physically moved a single millimeter during this extensive delay. By any objective visual metric available to the highly observant Americans, their silent allies had not even noticeably blinked their eyes. They absolutely had not slightly adjusted their heavy physical weight, shifted their tight tactical grip on their deadly issued weapons, or performed any of the 1,000 other tiny unconscious things. These are the incredibly small, strictly involuntary physical movements that normal human bodies continuously and instinctively execute when explicitly asked to remain entirely motionless for extended periods. Their absolute physical stillness was completely unnatural and deeply unnerving to witness in a combat zone. After nearly a full, agonizing hour of maintaining this incredibly painful, absolute physical freeze in the stifling, oppressive tropical heat, the Australian patrol commander finally broke the silence. He deliberately turned just his head, keeping absolutely everything else statue, still to avoid any visual detection, and quietly breathed exactly 2 distinct words directly into the waiting ear of the nearest tense American operator. He simply whispered that there was nothing there, and then, without any further explanation or unnecessary physical fanfare, the entire mixed patrol finally resumed its slow, methodical, and incredibly silent forward movement. It was exactly that incredibly tense, uneventful initial joint patrol that permanently planted the profound psychological seed of profound cultural change within the Americans. This pivotal moment of intense realization was definitively not sparked by a massive, chaotic kinetic firefight against overwhelming enemy forces. It was absolutely not triggered by a dramatic tactical reversal on the muddy battlefield, nor was it catalyzed by a harrowing near-death combat experience. Instead, it was simply a slow, incredibly quiet, and deeply unsettling practical demonstration of what absolute tactical patience actually looks like in reality. This was a masterclass revealing what intense patience functionally achieves when it is rigorously practiced daily at its absolute highest conceivable professional level. The exhausted American SEALs quietly returned to their fortified forward operating base later that humid evening, grappling deeply with something highly complex. It was a strange, lingering psychological sensation that they absolutely would not have been fully able to accurately articulate or formally name at that specific, confusing moment in time. It was definitely not merely a simple feeling of basic professional respect for their allied foreign military counterparts. They had originally arrived in the country already possessing profound professional respect, the specific courteous kind that highly elite Tier 1 military units traditionally extend to each other as a matter of standard protocol. This newly acquired feeling was something significantly more specific, deeper, and infinitely more unsettling to their egos. It was the highly particular, undeniable psychological discomfort of a master craftsman who has just unexpectedly watched someone else execute his own specialized craft at a totally incomprehensible level. They realized a terrifying level of mastery existed that they did not know was possible. The highly anticipated Second Joint Combat Patrol directly produced the specific legendary incident that eventually became deeply enshrined in the private oral tradition of the elite men involved. This was the exact, undeniable defining moment when absolutely everything they fundamentally understood about modern jungle warfare irrevocably changed forever. The heavily armed patrol had slowly and silently moved entirely undetected right up to the muddy, slippery bank of a distinctly slow-moving, coffee-colored jungle stream. This murky, flowing waterway cut directly through the dense, tangled vegetation at a somewhat shallow, entirely unimposing geographical angle. For the highly specialized maritime American SEALs, This specific type of wet riverine environment was definitively considered their absolute home territory. They confidently knew themselves to be the absolute finest, most lethal waterborne special operators functioning anywhere in the entire world. Therefore, executing a standard tactical river crossing fundamentally held absolutely no inherent fear or significant operational anxiety for any of them. Their collective operational instinct regarding this natural obstacle was utterly immediate, highly aggressive, and entirely professional based on their extensive specialized training. They wanted to attack the crossing immediately. Their ingrained tactical doctrine dictated that they must cross the exposed water incredibly fast, aggressively establish a dominant security perimeter on the far bank, and ruthlessly maintain their forward momentum. The confident American point man immediately stepped forward, moving aggressively toward the murky water's edge to initiate the rapid crossing. However, he absolutely did not reach the actual water. The silent Australian patrol commander's heavy, restraining hand seemingly appeared completely out of nowhere, landing firmly and definitively directly onto the tense American operator's shoulder. The weight of that hand communicated an absolute command. The sheer, unyielding physical weight of that firm hand explicitly communicated something that was definitively not a mere polite tactical suggestion to the surprised American. It was a silent, absolute command to immediately stop all forward movement. The Australian commander then silently pointed his finger directly upstream. He was definitely not pointing across at the opposing muddy bank, nor was he pointing out an imminent, visible physical threat. Instead, he pointed directly upstream into the dense, choking, overgrown natural undergrowth where the flowing stream completely bent entirely out of immediate visual sight. The strict tactical order that immediately followed this silent gesture was, by absolutely any conventional military logic or standard operational doctrine, completely and utterly insane. They were silently instructed that they were going to slowly wade exactly 300 meters directly upstream. They would be fully submerged in the murky water right up to their vulnerable necks, physically fighting the strong, continuous river current the entire way before finally crossing. The highly aggressive Americans reluctantly accepted this bizarre, agonizing directive with varying internal degrees of extreme, boiling fury and forced exterior professional compliance. For 45 agonizing, exhausting minutes, the heavily burdened operators slowly moved through the flowing river currents, completely mimicking floating natural debris. They stayed incredibly slow, maintaining an extremely low physical profile in the dark water. They were absolutely meticulous about making no distinct, unnatural splashing sound that the moving water itself did not already naturally generate. They painstakingly continued this miserable, freezing upstream movement until they finally reached a specific, submerged, rocky natural shelf. Here, the solid stream bed consisted entirely of hard, unyielding natural stone, completely devoid of soft mud. Because of this hard stone surface, their heavy, wet combat boots would absolutely leave no discernible physical impression or trackable muddy footprints behind upon exiting the river. They slowly, silently dragged their freezing, exhausted bodies directly out of the moving water. They instantly melted completely back into the dense, covering tropical ferns lining the riverbank. They silently waited there, completely motionless and still, heavily dripping wet. From this deeply concealed, elevated vantage point, they quietly watched the exact muddy bank they had originally intended to rapidly climb exactly 1 hour prior. Exactly 55 tense minutes later, a highly armed, dangerous combat patrol of expert Viet Cong jungle trackers suddenly emerged directly from the dense tree line on the far side of the river. These lethal enemy soldiers were actively leading 2 highly trained, aggressive hunting dogs tightly secured on long, braided leather leashes. The eager, sniffing animals aggressively went directly straight to the murky water's edge right at the Americans' originally intended, highly predictable crossing point. Their wet noses were aggressively down. The frustrated dogs were aggressively searching for physical evidence that was simply not there. The specific human prey they were actively hunting had miraculously walked exactly 300 meters in the completely wrong tactical direction. The Allied patrol was now sitting entirely invisible on a hard rock shelf, silently and patiently watching the enemy trackers completely fail in their mission. The confused Viet Cong trackers soon began arguing among themselves in low, frustrated voices. The tracking dogs had completely lost the human scent entirely in the fast-moving, murky river water. After several tense minutes of fruitless searching, the frustrated enemy patrol finally gave up and slowly moved on. The silent Australians then slowly turned their camouflaged heads to look directly at the stunned Americans. Absolutely nobody in the entire joint patrol said a single spoken word because absolutely nothing verbally needed to be explicitly said. That profound, silent moment was the ultimate, absolute recontextualization of everything they knew. That was the precise moment when absolutely everything the American SEALs had previously filed under annoying, excessive Allied caution immediately got entirely reclassified. Every single tactical action they had previously misread as profound paranoia was now clearly revealed as pure, absolute, cold-blooded calculation. What they had foolishly read as fearful hesitation was actually incredible, life-saving tactical prescience. The incredibly silent Australians had absolutely never been physically afraid of crossing the river. They had simply been brilliantly thinking exactly 3 critical steps ahead of a highly capable indigenous enemy that the incredibly aggressive Americans had not yet fully learned to accurately model. The massive tactical gap between reacting to a visible threat and anticipating a hidden consequence was everything. What systematically followed over the next several exhausting months was a profound operational phenomenon that currently possesses absolutely no official designation within any standard military doctrine manual. This unique evolution was completely informal and definitively never properly codified by high command. It was effectively a voluntary, highly intensive, and in many crucial respects, deeply humbling tactical apprenticeship for the American SEALs. This elite maritime commando force, widely considered the absolute most lethal unit the United States had ever produced, actively chose to willingly submit to this rigorous, silent education. The eager American operators slowly began to intently study their silent Australian counterparts exactly the way a dedicated, passionate musician closely studies an absolute master of their chosen craft. They definitively did not attempt this complex learning process through simple, superficial, physical imitation. Instead, they actively learned through a deep psychological process of total environmental absorption. They carefully watched exactly how the specialized Australian commandos physically moved their bodies through the incredibly dense, unforgiving jungle vegetation during incredibly long, deeply exhausting, and highly dangerous extended reconnaissance patrols. What the fascinated Americans repeatedly witnessed was a complete, fundamental renegotiation of the standard physical relationship existing strictly between a fragile human body and its immediate, hostile, natural environment. The highly skilled Australians absolutely did not forcefully walk directly through the tangled jungle vegetation. Instead, they seamlessly navigated the complex, overgrown terrain exactly the way flowing water naturally navigates a rugged physical landscape. They possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to effortlessly find the absolute path of least natural resistance while moving silently through the dense tropical environment. These elite Allied operators consistently chose to smoothly move completely around large physical obstacles rather than aggressively attempting to forcefully push directly through them. They intentionally bent their physical bodies seamlessly to match the existing natural terrain rather than foolishly attempting to aggressively impose their own unnatural human shape upon it. When stepping forward, they deliberately placed the outside edge of their heavy combat boot down first. They then slowly rolled their shifting weight entirely inward, carefully feeling for dry wood before finally committing any actual physical weight. They routinely angled their torsos completely sideways to cautiously pass directly through incredibly dense, hanging tropical vegetation without physically displacing a single green leaf. This extreme caution was fundamentally necessary because a violently bent tree branch inevitably springs rapidly back into its original position. Furthermore, a suddenly swaying green bush is highly visible to a trained enemy observer for up to 50 meters in the correct jungle lighting. Therefore, disturbing absolutely anything in the immediate natural environment was considered a massive, potentially fatal tactical error by the Australians. They meticulously timed their slow, calculated physical movements to perfectly coincide with naturally occurring auditory disturbances within the surrounding jungle environment. They would patiently wait for a sudden gust of evening wind, the unexpected loud noise of a startled tropical bird, or the rhythmic sound of falling rain. They ingeniously ensured that absolutely any unavoidable human sound they accidentally made was immediately and completely buried deep within the existing ambient natural noise. They essentially moved in incredibly short, unpredictable bursts of calculated physical activity to completely mask their presence. They respectfully treated the surrounding, dangerous jungle environment exactly as though it were a massive, incredibly dangerous sleeping predator that they were desperately attempting not to accidentally awaken. The highly aggressive American operators, who had previously been forcefully crashing directly through this exact same foliage like confident men who entirely owned it, watched this closely. They slowly began the incredibly difficult, highly frustrating, and massively ego-demanding internal psychological process of actively learning how to physically move their bodies entirely differently through the hostile, unforgiving, and deeply challenging combat zone. However, the grueling physical movement lessons were merely the beginning, because the absolute stillness exercises proved to be significantly harder for the restless Americans to endure. One particularly humid night, a combined international combat patrol quietly settled directly into a hidden ambush position located on a muddy, elevated jungle ridge. This specific tactical location explicitly overlooked a known, highly active supply trail frequently utilized by heavily armed North Vietnamese Army logistics columns moving under the covering darkness. It was a standard tactical setup, requiring absolute standard operational noise discipline. The incredibly disciplined Australians silently laid down securely in their designated tactical firing positions and immediately became something that was exceptionally difficult to biologically categorize as currently alive. They absolutely did not establish a standard watch rotation schedule for the long night ahead. Absolutely no specific operator was formally designated to remain on active guard duty while the other exhausted men temporarily slept. This was simply because absolutely no one in the entire hidden patrol was going to intentionally sleep during this incredibly vital combat mission. They were strictly prepared to silently lie there completely motionless in the wet mud for as many grueling hours as it absolutely took to accomplish their objective. They readily endured horrific physical conditions that specifically included freezing ground moisture, thousands of biting jungle insects, and severe muscular cramps. These agonizing physical cramps steadily built from mild, annoying discomfort directly into genuine, screaming physical agony over the incredibly long course of many dark hours. They endured all of this immense suffering, engulfed in absolute, terrifying, and oppressive jungle darkness. Most importantly, they were fully committed to enduring absolutely all of this intense, prolonged physical torture without executing a single, tiny physical movement. They were absolutely not merely focusing on systematically minimizing their physical movement or strictly reducing any unnecessary bodily shifting. Their strict operational doctrine explicitly demanded absolute, total zero movement. A highly trained American special operator, physically conditioned to endure extreme selection standards that would utterly break most normal human beings, suddenly found himself heavily struggling deeply within the very first 2 hours of this agonizing ambush. The American commando was surprisingly not struggling intensely with the extreme physical discomfort of the freezing mud because he had previously survived significantly worse environmental conditions. Instead, he was aggressively wrestling with the massive, crushing psychological weight of maintaining that unnatural, absolute physical stillness. He was violently fighting the terrifying internal feeling that temporal time had completely stopped moving forward entirely. The dense, oppressive surrounding jungle genuinely felt exactly like it was forcefully pressing directly down upon his chest with an immense, suffocating, and strictly physical downward force. In stark contrast, the Allied Australians lying silently directly beside him in the exact same miserable environmental conditions appeared to have completely resolved this complex psychological problem. They utilized a deeply hidden, highly effective interior mental mechanism that the frustrated Americans simply could not identify or replicate. They had seemingly retreated completely inward, going completely dark somewhere, extremely deep inside their own isolated minds. They had intentionally and successfully turned off the specific conscious part of the human brain that continuously measures time actively passing in the physical world. They successfully replaced that urgent internal biological clock with something significantly slower, something that fundamentally possessed absolutely no psychological relationship with immediate temporal urgency at all. Finally, just before the pale morning dawn broke, a massive column of heavily armed enemy soldiers casually walked directly into the center of the established kill zone. These confident enemy troops were loudly talking among themselves and appeared completely relaxed. They were utterly confident that they were completely alone in the dark jungle, utterly unaware of the invisible, lethal predators waiting silently nearby. They were, of course, tragically mistaken in their immense overconfidence. The devastating ambush, when it finally violently erupted from the silent tree line, lasted for only a few incredibly brief seconds. It was exactly 7 seconds of perfect, mechanical, and utterly merciless kinetic destruction. This sheer, overwhelming violence was birthed entirely and exclusively from those agonizing previous hours of seemingly inhuman, absolute physical patience. In the smoky, bloody aftermath of the sudden engagement, one exhausted American SEAL sat completely silently for a very long time before slowly cleaning his weapon. He was quietly thinking extremely deeply about something profound that had just fundamentally shifted inside his own combat philosophy. Later in his life, he would explicitly describe the profound revelation of that specific, life-changing thought as follows. He honestly admitted that he had proudly spent his entire elite military career aggressively trying to be the absolute sharpest, deadliest knife located in the proverbial drawer. His entire professional identity was entirely wrapped up in generating overwhelming kinetic speed, massive aggressive action, and executing immediate, devastating physical dominance over his enemies. However, somewhere deep within that incredibly long, agonizingly dark jungle wait, he had finally understood a crucial truth for the very first time. He realized that sometimes the absolute most dangerous, lethal thing located in the entire room is definitively not a sharp knife at all. Sometimes, the ultimate weapon is simply a completely motionless stone. The complex doctrinal concept of absolute physical restraint, of actively choosing not to fire your weapon when pulling the trigger was entirely possible, was perhaps the absolute hardest tactical lesson of all to master. This specific tactical restraint completely ran directly against absolutely everything deeply ingrained within the standard American SEAL psychological profile. These elite maritime operators were specifically selected during basic underwater demolition training, in large part for their extreme willingness to immediately act violently under massive pressure. They were heavily praised for the total absence of any tactical hesitation whenever a viable enemy target suddenly presented itself in combat. The deeply ingrained aggressive instinct to immediately neutralize any visible threat was definitely not considered a psychological weakness in these highly capable men. It was actively treated as a heavily cultivated, highly prized operational strength meticulously honed through many thousands of repetitive training drills. It was drilled continuously until it became exactly as automatic and unconscious as basic human breathing. Asking these hyper-aggressive, elite warriors to consciously override that fundamental killing instinct required massive discipline. It required a complete, fundamental psychological reorientation regarding what the specific word threat actually meant in a broader tactical context. This massive paradigm shift was severely tested during a subsequent long-range reconnaissance patrol deep within contested enemy territory. The highly skilled combined coalition team had silently identified exactly 3 armed Viet Cong forward scouts slowly moving along a narrow, overgrown jungle trail. They were incredibly easy targets offering beautifully clean, unobstructed sniper shots. The tense American point man immediately raised his heavy weapon with the smooth, fluid, terrifying inevitability of a highly trained man doing exactly what he was biologically built to do. Suddenly, an allied Australian corporal's incredibly steady hand magically appeared completely out of nowhere, resting directly on the hot metal of the American's rifle barrel. The Australian's physical intervention was incredibly slow, completely devoid of any panicked urgency, but possessing a gentle, absolute, undeniable physical refusal to allow the shot. He offered exactly one incredibly slow, silent shake of his camouflaged head. The heavily armed Americans reluctantly held their immediate deadly fire. They lay completely silently in the freezing mud, while 3 heavily armed enemy soldiers walked past them, close enough to literally smell their unwashed bodies. The highly trained SEALs intentionally did absolutely nothing at all, forcing themselves to remain perfectly still like statues. They silently held their hidden, compromised position for exactly 30 agonizing minutes after that terrifying close encounter, intently watching the completely empty jungle trail. Then the actual main enemy column finally arrived. Over 100 heavily armed enemy soldiers slowly appeared, heavily carrying massive wooden crates of explosive rockets and deadly mortar rounds. This massive cache contained enough lethal ammunition to successfully fuel several weeks of devastating regional offensive combat operations. The 3 initial scouts had merely been the expendable eyes, But this massive trailing column was the true ultimate prize. If the first three enemy scouts had been immediately neutralized by the aggressive SEALs, the massive main column would have instantly scattered directly into the dense jungle and disappeared completely. The massive operational intelligence opportunity would have been permanently gone forever. Every single crucial element of the grueling patrol's vital reconnaissance mission would have been tragically reduced to merely 3 dead bodies. They would have achieved nothing except the frustrating auditory sound of 100 heavily armed enemy soldiers instantly melting away into the surrounding protective tropical trees without a trace. What the silent Australians had profoundly understood, and what they had brilliantly communicated strictly through that one quiet hand on a gun barrel, was profound. They deeply understood that warfare inherently possesses a complex underlying logic significantly deeper than any single isolated tactical engagement. You absolutely do not aggressively take the small, vulnerable piece immediately placed directly in front of you when taking it permanently closes the door on something infinitely more strategically valuable located slightly behind it. This requires incredibly delayed gratification that was completely foreign to the SEALs. The deeply frustrated American SEAL, who had nearly fired his weapon, spent a very long time thinking intently afterward with that profound philosophical thought. He realized he had been aggressively playing one extremely limited kinetic game. The brilliant Australians were playing a completely different strategic game entirely, operating effectively on a vastly larger tactical board. They possessed an unbelievable capacity for delayed combat gratification that he had absolutely never encountered in any normal human being, let alone a highly trained, elite Tier 1 Special Operations soldier operating in a deadly combat zone. However, the absolute most terrifying education came definitively not from any standard reconnaissance patrol conducted in the ordinary military sense. It unexpectedly arrived on a miserable night, so unbelievably dark that actual human visibility dropped to mere inches. They were operating deep within a highly restricted, notoriously deadly sector of the jungle. The official tactical maps designated this specific area with the kind of dry, geographical label that completely fails to adequately capture the sheer horror of what it was actually like to be physically trapped inside it. This was the Green Zone. The Green Zone was essentially a polite military euphemism describing a hostile place so incredibly saturated with heavy enemy presence that conventional Allied units were absolutely never sent there. Even highly elite special operations teams moved through this terrifying sector with the highly specific, dreadful feeling of a nervous man blindly walking directly through a dark room he absolutely knows is heavily mined, but he absolutely cannot see where the deadly explosives are hidden. The combined international patrol had quietly inserted exactly at dusk, making for an elevated observation ridge. This specific tactical ridge theoretically promised a crystal-clear observation line looking directly over a massive, steep valley possessing heavy, confirmed enemy logistical activity. Unfortunately, the brutal seasonal monsoon had forcefully arrived with absolutely all the devastating lack of subtlety of a massive biblical weather event. It rapidly turned the suffocating jungle into a solid, impenetrable wall of warm, gray, auditory noise. It instantly reduced the surrounding steep terrain into a treacherous, thick soup of deep mud that aggressively swallowed heavy combat boots directly up to the ankle with every single agonizing step forward. The catastrophic navigational error, when it inevitably happened in the blinding darkness, was incredibly minor, measuring significantly less than 300 meters. It was merely a simple, tiny compass drift, a confusing, rain-obscured terrain feature, or perhaps a muddy ridge that unfortunately looked exactly like another muddy ridge in the absolute pitch black. A deviation of 300 meters in absolutely any other conventional war or in any other normal geographical landscape would have fundamentally meant absolutely nothing. It would have merely been a tiny footnote, a brief, highly forgettable tactical detour. However, this specific geographical location was definitively not any other normal landscape on Earth. Exactly 300 meters in the completely wrong tactical direction here meant something utterly catastrophic. When the tense American point man suddenly stopped completely dead and immediately signaled a tactical freeze with a physical rigidity that was almost incredibly violent, it was incredibly bad. It was absolutely not because he had finally found the outer edge of the fortified enemy perimeter. It was horrifyingly because he had just suddenly realized that they were already standing directly inside it. The dark, terrifying shapes slowly and terrifyingly resolved themselves directly out of the blinding, rainy darkness They were enemy hammocks. There were literally dozens of them securely strung between the thick jungle trees at regular intervals. These sleeping positions extended continuously in absolutely all directions, as far as the heavy rain and the absolute pitch dark would allow limited human vision to accurately reach. The unmistakable, pungent smell suddenly arrived at the exact same terrifying moment. It was the incredibly close, heavy, unmistakably specific smell of hundreds of sleeping enemy soldiers. They were horrifyingly standing, completely exposed directly in the absolute middle of a massive, heavily fortified Viet Cong battalion base camp. They were completely surrounded on absolutely all sides by hundreds of sleeping, heavily armed enemy troops. The tiny patrol was massively outnumbered by a staggering mathematical ratio that made absolutely any realistic calculation of kinetic military resistance genuinely feel like a completely sick joke possessing absolutely no humorous punchline. Death was seemingly guaranteed. The American machine gunner instinctively dropped his heavy weapon directly down to his hip in sheer panic. His trembling thumb aggressively rested directly on the metal safety switch before absolutely any conscious tactical decision had even been rationally made. His deeply ingrained kinetic training had instantly kicked in completely beneath the conscious level of rational human thought. Standard American naval doctrine loudly dictated that if you are completely surrounded, you must immediately attack. You must violently create massive chaos. You must aggressively make the confused enemy completely afraid of the sheer, deafening noise you are about to produce, desperately fighting your way out using sheer, overwhelming physical violence. That aggressive kinetic response was exactly what every single fiber of his intense military training was loudly screaming at him to execute in that horrifying moment of certain death. However, the silent Australian patrol commander's heavy, restraining hand immediately landed firmly on his tense wrist. It was an incredibly quiet and utterly total physical intervention. There were absolutely no spoken words, just the sheer weight of a commanding grip that contained an entire philosophical argument strictly in its firm pressure. The message was clear: do absolutely nothing and remain completely silent. And then, operating in the absolute pitch darkness, completely surrounded by hundreds of deeply sleeping enemy soldiers whose loaded weapons were literally within arm's reach, the Australian commander initiated a miracle. He slowly began to physically move completely backward. He did not move quickly or in a panicked rush. He moved backward deliberately along the exact same muddy path they had originally come. He meticulously placed each heavy combat boot perfectly into the previous muddy impression left behind, ensuring he disturbed absolutely nothing that had not already been previously disturbed. The terrified Americans followed, miraculously becoming significantly less present with each agonizing backward step until they effectively became something drastically less than actual ghosts. Exactly 4 agonizing hours. That is exactly how long it incredibly took the traumatized patrol to slowly cover a mere 200 meters of muddy terrain. It required exactly 4 horrific hours of continuously placing heavy combat boots down with the absolute terrifying precision of a master surgeon. It meant 4 solid hours of desperately breathing through tightly clenched teeth while suppressing every single natural human instinct. The torrential monsoon rain loudly hammered the thick green canopy directly overhead, while the massive sleeping enemy camp softly breathed completely around them in the dark. At one particularly terrifying point during the retreat, a sleeping Viet Cong soldier, lying directly on the wet ground right in the intended path of the escaping patrol, suddenly rolled over. He was muttering something entirely indistinct in his deep sleep, and his resting hand accidentally brushed directly against the wet combat boot of a terrified American operator who was incredibly caught entirely in mid-step. The American's full physical weight was precariously balanced entirely upon his back foot. The highly trained American instantly froze completely solid like a stone statue, his raised foot hanging precariously suspended directly in the empty air. His entire muscular body immediately became a massive, agonizing question mark, suspended heavily upon a single, shaky point of physical balance. For exactly 5 full, agonizing minutes, he stood exactly like that, terrified and completely motionless. He kept his weight shifted entirely backward, his heavy combat boots suspended precariously while the sleeping enemy soldier resettled. During those 5 agonizing minutes, the oxygenated blood entirely left his raised human leg, and the strained muscles slowly began to violently cramp with a low, building biological fire. He silently stood there, feeling the excruciating pain, yet he absolutely did not move a single millimeter and did not make a single tiny sound. He completely focused on absolutely nothing except the tiny, single millimeter of empty physical clearance existing strictly between his hovering heavy boot and the sleeping man who would instantly kill him if awakened. The highly experienced Australians were intensely monitoring absolutely everything occurring around them in the terrifying darkness. A firm, steadying hand was gently placed on a trembling shoulder to effectively regulate panicked human breathing. A slow, silent shake of the camouflaged head immediately occurred whenever a terrified operator's nervous exhale became dangerously too loud. They had successfully converted their physical bodies into absolute, magical shepherds of pure silence. They were actively managing the terrified Americans directly through an incredibly narrow, highly dangerous temporal tunnel of absolute, unbelievable physical restraint and mental discipline. This specific tunnel of restraint was definitively so incredibly narrow that a single accidental cough, or any single involuntary human sound whatsoever, would have instantly collapsed it entirely, resulting in their immediate violent deaths. When they finally miraculously cleared the fortified outer enemy perimeter and silently slid deep into the dense covering jungle on the completely far side of the massive camp, the surviving Americans absolutely did not celebrate. They slowly sat down heavily against the wet trees in the hammering monsoon rain and uncontrollably shook with massive, overwhelming trauma. They were absolutely not shaking from the freezing cold temperature of the pouring rain. They were violently shaking strictly from the highly specific, overwhelming physical aftermath of sustaining extreme, unyielding psychological fear that had been completely internally suppressed for 4 straight hours. These were highly hardened military veterans who had previously cleared heavily fortified bunkers, survived massive ambushes, and routinely done things that would have permanently destroyed most normal human beings. Yet, they sat completely broken in the dark mud and violently shook, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated terror. The Australian commandos quietly sat directly beside the shaking Americans in the deep mud and simply waited incredibly patiently for the massive adrenaline dump to finally pass. They profoundly understood exactly what this physical reaction was, and they absolutely did not judge the Americans for it. Nor did they attempt to rush the healing process. One of the hardened SEALs who miraculously survived that horrifying night explicitly said many years later that he had thought intently about that specific terrifying incident almost every single day since he returned home. He thought about it continuously, not because it was the absolute worst kinetic thing he had ever physically experienced in combat, even though it undeniably was. He remembered it precisely because it finally taught him a profound lesson that absolutely no amount of rigorous American kinetic training had ever successfully taught him. He famously noted that the brilliant Australians definitively did not miraculously save their lives that night by being physically braver than the Americans. Rather, they successfully saved the patrol exclusively by being significantly calmer than the Americans. He eventually admitted that he had subsequently spent 20 full years serving in elite special operations, actively trying to fundamentally figure out if absolute calmness and sheer physical bravery are exactly the same psychological thing or completely different human concepts entirely. The profound narrative hook here is precisely the realization that true elite lethality fundamentally relies upon unparalleled psychological control, not merely overwhelming firepower. This chilling realization permanently altered the Americans, fundamentally setting the stage for the final, incredible synthesis of their 2 distinct warrior cultures in the closing chapter. I still do not know the answer to whether bravery and calmness are exactly the same thing, but here is the critical historical truth that simplified versions always conveniently leave out. The cultural exchange was definitively not one-directional. The Australians were definitely not some silent, perfect tribe of mystical jungle shamans merely dispensing ancient wisdom to the blundering Americans. They were the ultimate pragmatists, which is perhaps the absolute most important psychological thing you can say about any elite soldier who manages to survive a combat deployment. The Australians meticulously watched the American SEALs with the exact same analytical attention the SEALs were intensely paying to them. What they explicitly saw immediately made their own professional eyes widen in several distinct ways they would absolutely not admit out loud. The Americans possessed specific tactical weapons that the pragmatic Australians immediately wanted to acquire. They definitively did not desire these firearms as symbolic wartime trophies, but rather as highly functional, desperately needed lethal tools strictly designed to effectively keep them breathing during combat. The standard Australian Special Air Service rifle of that specific historical period was a surprisingly long, exceptionally heavy battle weapon, originally designed for open European engagement. It was a magnificent piece of mechanical engineering completely utilized for the wrong geographical war. It was exactly like bringing a massive, blunt sledgehammer to a delicate watchmaker's intricate bench. Conversely, the American SEALs seamlessly moved through that exact same restrictive jungle carrying highly compact, incredibly lightweight lethal carbines that could quickly swing around in a dense thicket. The heavy, cumbersome Australian weapons simply could not match that incredible rotational speed. The highly observant Australians systematically noted this crucial tactical discrepancy with the specific, calibrated envy of hardened military professionals. They immediately began quietly acquiring American carbines directly through the vast informal logistical economy that inevitably exists within every theater of war. Through complex trades involving captured enemy equipment and collected personal favors, the armories of Australian patrols slowly began to shift silently without any official doctrinal policy change ever occurring. They shifted strictly toward the compact tactical weapons that actually fit the restrictive, suffocating jungle environment they were constantly operating inside. They also closely watched the aggressive American relationship with utilizing massive air power, and they immediately felt something fundamentally shift within their own operational doctrine. The traditional Australian operational tradition was strictly pedestrian in the absolute most literal sense. You methodically walked in, you walked out, and you physically carried absolutely everything you needed heavily strapped directly onto your sweating back for the entire mission. The dense jungle was always considered your natural element, your primary survival resource, and your only physical cover. This grueling pedestrian philosophy was historically a massive source of enormous cultural pride. However, the Australians began to slowly realize it was sometimes an unnecessary tactical constraint. The confident SEALs routinely treated massive military helicopters strictly as standard tactical instruments, rather than rare operational privileges. They aggressively called in fast extractions with an overwhelming tactical confidence that miraculously turned the thin ambient air itself into an escape route. The Americans had effectively developed the dangerous hot extraction into a highly refined, aggressive tactical art form. You violently hit the designated target, rapidly break contact, move quickly to a designated clearing, the helicopter instantly arrives, and the mission is done. The Australians had previously filed this specific operational behavior strictly under American impatience. They quickly began to accurately reclassify it directly under sheer operational efficiency. They absolutely did not abandon their foundational ghost philosophy, which firmly remained the unbreakable spine of everything they executed. They ingeniously added massive kinetic speed exactly at the back end, specifically during the extraction phase. This definitively ensured the profound patience of their silent approach was not squandered during a slow withdrawal through compromised terrain. By the middle of that turbulent year, Australian patrols were coordinating smoothly with rotary wing assets with an incredible operational fluency. Furthermore, there was something significantly subtler still that the pragmatic Australians absorbed from the aggressive Americans during their incredibly long, exhausting jungle patrols together in the unforgiving highlands. It was something that absolutely does not fit neatly into any standard military doctrine manual because it is substantially less about combat technique and far more about human temperament. The highly capable Americans inherently possessed an aggressive engineering relationship with their own physical limitations. Where an Australian trooper would patiently make do with officially issued equipment, the American SEAL would act completely differently. A SEAL would critically look at a piece of kit, systematically identify exactly what was mechanically wrong, and ruthlessly fix the glaring problem. They would aggressively cut the heavy rifle barrel down, tape the noisy buckle differently, or waterproof the fragile radio with a simple condom and a rubber band. They would ingeniously rig the emergency strobe light directly to the compass for rapid aerial signaling. There was a relentless, iterative refusal to ever accept that physical things could not be systematically improved. The observant Australians surprisingly found this highly infectious in a way they absolutely did not immediately expect to experience during their grueling military combat deployments. They rapidly began to creatively modify their own heavy webbing, actively adding extra pockets, repositioning heavy ammunition pouches for much faster access, and adjusting complex load distribution strictly for the specific jungle terrain. The SAS had always heavily valued tactical adaptability as a strict philosophical principle. However, the Americans effectively showed them exactly what it successfully looked like as a daily, relentless physical practice. By the crucial time the two forces finally entered their absolute final operational phase together, they had profoundly changed each other entirely. The hardened veterans of both elite units universally remember this final shared deployment as their defining historical mission. They were definitely no longer the exact same separate units that had originally arrived in that initial insertion clearing months prior. They were something entirely new that had absolutely not existed before and has not been officially named since. The aggressive Americans now moved seamlessly through the jungle with a terrifying quietness. The silent Australians now carried compact weapons their traditional doctrine had never officially specified before. They effectively became each other's absolute best versions strictly by incorporating exactly what the other critically lacked. The massive final mission was the perfect convergence of both distinct philosophies into a single devastating act. Military intelligence had identified a massive North Vietnamese logistics column slowly moving through punishing hill country. The combined team seamlessly inserted in brutal monsoon conditions, enduring 48 continuous hours of exhausting tactical movement. They successfully endured the specific, grinding physical agony that both demanding doctrines strictly required in vastly different ways. The Americans aggressively applied their sheer physical intensity, while the Australians successfully applied their temporal patience. The terrifying result was a perfect hybrid team that could magically sustain itself longer and move significantly more quietly than either component could have ever managed completely alone. They successfully established a lethal L-shaped ambush exactly on a muddy rise directly above the active enemy trail. They silently waited with the settled, geological stillness of hardened men who successfully decided that temporal time itself was no longer their enemy. When the forward enemy scouts finally appeared on the third rainy morning, checking the muddy trail with wary expertise, the American machine gunner felt the familiar gravity of his training pulling his finger. However, he vividly remembered a quiet hand on a hot barrel. He silently let them pass without firing. He slowly counted his own pounding heartbeats and intently watched them disappear safely around the dark bend. Then followed an agonizing hour of the absolute most demanding physical silence he had ever miraculously produced. Then the muddy ground slowly began to softly vibrate beneath their freezing bodies. The massive main enemy column finally materialized directly from the blinding rain like a dark, unstoppable river finding its own course. There were dozens of confident enemy soldiers heavily carrying lethal ammunition sufficient to sustain many weeks of offensive combat operations. They were loudly moving with the easy confidence of men whose advanced scouts had safely cleared the way. The silent Australian commander simply offered exactly one single, almost imperceptible tactical nod. That quiet nod perfectly arrived at the exact moment the massive enemy center perfectly aligned with the hidden American explosives. The tense American operator aggressively squeezed the firing clacker. What incredibly happened next lasted exactly 7 terrifying, violent seconds. During those 7 violent seconds, the dense jungle entirely ceased to be a natural jungle and violently became something else entirely. It was a complete, 7-second violent rearrangement of the physical world conducted flawlessly by a perfectly synthesized team that had been forged over many agonizing months. And then the extreme violence was completely over. The oppressive, heavy silence that immediately came rushing back into the destroyed tree line was absolute and total. In the smoky, bloody aftermath, a small but incredibly revealing interaction softly happened that explicitly said absolutely everything about both distinct cultures. The surviving Americans were physically vibrating intensely. They were experiencing that specific electrical, full-body aliveness that immediately follows extreme violence and sheer survival, letting you clearly know you are undeniably still alive and functionally capable of fighting. Conversely, the calm Australians slowly stood up and methodically began picking up shiny brass bullet casings without displaying any evident human emotion. They casually began checking their wet boots for embedded leeches. When a deeply shocked American SEAL asked with genuine bafflement if absolutely anything ever bothered him, the Australian calmly wiped mud from his weapon. He plainly stated that blind human panic was always a completely useless waste of good operational energy. Then he slowly began moving silently toward the designated aerial extraction point. The Americans quickly followed closely behind, still physically buzzing like overloaded electrical power lines. The silent Australians smoothly moved precisely like flowing water finally finding the massive sea. It was exactly two completely different operational speeds heading in the exact same tactical direction, producing the exact same devastating outcome. They completely shared the exact same unspoken, profound understanding of what they had miraculously built together in the absolute darkness. The brutal war eventually ended, and the dark jungles slowly closed entirely over the forgotten trails. The specific classified missions eventually became declassified, then largely forgotten in the exact way that highly complicated historical things are always tragically forgotten in favor of significantly simpler, patriotic narratives. However, the profound lesson absolutely did not ever forget itself. It quietly kept traveling directly through every single global theater that subsequently followed. The incredible legacy survived strictly through the memory of a quiet hand on a weapon barrel that perfectly arrived at exactly the right moment to teach the true calculus of absolute silence. You can actively find the undeniable evidence of this specific historical encounter if you simply know exactly where to carefully look. You can see it clearly in the deliberate way the absolute most dangerous modern operators intentionally slow down when absolutely everyone else speeds up. The most violent, psychologically devastating thing you can ever possibly do to an enemy is to successfully make him truly believe he is entirely alone in a dark space that you are already silently and patiently occupying.